We're to the second part of our third installment of the Crash Course in Jewish History, Jewish Rebellions. And let's understand Jewish society at the time. Just to orient ourselves here, we have on the left timeline, starting with what we talked about in the first installment about the Hanukkah story and Judah Maccabee. Going through, that is 165 BCE, going through to past the Greek period to the Roman occupation, the period Herod the Great, and we are going to give the background of this whole period, during which Jewish society started to, let's say, fracture, divide itself into different ideologies and different movements and different groups. And of course, this is not very different from what goes on in today's times and what has always gone on. Two Jews, three opinions. And we're going to look at who some of those groups were and the historical significance and finds that we have regarding. The main group we will talk about is the Pharisees. The word Pharisee comes from Perushim. It literally means those who are separate, which could mean they had some ascetic tendencies, in other words, separating from the world, creating boundaries to protect their spiritual lives and purity. And they formed the primary group. Their followers were mostly amongst the people, the populace, the common people. And their leaders were the rabbis of what people call Rabbinic Judaism or traditional Judaism, with the tradition being traced all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai, and particularly focused on the oral law, the study of it, and the living of it. The Sadducees, who we already talked about beginning with the period of the Hellenization of Jewish society, tended to be more upscale. They likened themselves to be the descendants of Tzadok, who was one of the high priests. Many of them were Kohanim, or their leaders were Kohanim, priests. They tended to be more assimilated and more upper class in the urban areas, and they rejected the oral law. They believed only in the written law and did not accept the teachings of the oral law and did not practice it. So living part of the Torah, but not all of it. Another group who got a lot of recognition in recent time are the Essenes. And the reason for the recognition is because it's believed that they are the people behind the writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we will have to talk about. We'll return to that. They lived in Qumran, primarily, which is next to the Dead Sea. They were ascetics, tended to shun wealth and opulence and anything ostentatious, lived very simple, austere lives, were very focused on the religious teachings as well, and we'll return to them. The next group are the Biryonim, the Zealots. They were political activists, and we'll talk about how some of them became very extreme, even to the point of assassinating other Jews. And also, of course, all of this we can understand and see parallels to modern times as well. And then finally, we have the Notzrim from Nazareth, Notzrim, Nazar, and these are the early Christians. And we're going to be talking about Jewish Jesus and the background of his life. So the first group I'd like to speak about are the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls got a lot of publicity, and the find was astounding. In 1946, a Bedouin shepherd ventured into one of the caves in the Dead Sea area to try and find his goat or his sheep that was grazing. And he found some parchments, brought them to a collector or a vendor, antiquities vendor in the old city of Jerusalem. There was spotted by Professor Sukenik of Hebrew University, an archaeology history professor, and he kind of played it cool. He said, oh, they're probably, some historic Jewish parchments. Now, this could have been a 15th, 16th century Torah. So he bought a few pieces. He said, let me see, I'll come back. And by the way it was written, he already thought that might have been more older and precious than his originally let on. And sure enough, he began to realize that this was an extraordinary find going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so he came back and tried to still play it cool. He started to buy off more and more of what this vendor had. He said, can you obtain more? But somewhere along the process, word got out that these were extremely valuable and extremely ancient. And so in the middle of the throes of Israel trying to fight its war of independence, this professor was trying to raise what became hundreds of thousands of dollars, which at the time was an enormous sum. And he bought back some of them, but not all of them. The rest remained in what would become East Jerusalem. And we'll talk about that as well. Now, why were these so important? So there's the Christian view and the Jewish view. From the Jewish side, the oldest Torah that we had was the Leningrad Codex, which went back to about the 8th century of the Common Era, about 1,200 years ago, and it was a text of the Torah. What the Dead Sea Scrolls did is they pushed back close to 1,000 years the extant copies of the oldest Torah, books of prophets, Jewish sacred writings that we have. And that is an extraordinary find because it shows the antiquity of our people in the land and antiquity of our teachings and of the Torah. Of course, this is still 1,300 years after the Torah was given. And we talked about how they found a silver inscription of a verse from the Torah from the 6th or 7th century BCE, but extraordinary find nonetheless. And along with the Torah findings, they found writings from the Essenes. We'll talk about who they were. You can go to the Israel Museum and they have the Isaiah scroll. It's in a building that looks like a Hershey's Kiss. At the top of these amphora, of these clay jugs that they were found in. And the copy in there is actually a reproduction, but it's unwound around the whole building, the whole inside of the circular building, quite dramatic. They also found large parts of Torah text and other writings. Now, who were these Essenes? One of the peculiar things that was noticed was that in the cemetery, there were no women. There also were a lot of mikvahs, the ritual baths, which men also immersed in. And their theology was very focused on the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the devil, the influence of the dark side, and also on messianic yearnings that there would be a redemption soon, and there would be great upheaval and a war of the sons of darkness and the sons of light. And Christians wanted to see in this precursors of Christian theology and belief, and maybe even predictions. The mikvahs were the baptism that they were already performing. The lack of women's graves were celibacy. Look, see, there were already celibate monks even before Jesus. Now, the study of the actual Dead Sea Scrolls was very difficult because they were very old and somewhat damaged, although they survived, even though they're parchment, because in the Dead Sea, it's very dry, so they don't disintegrate. Jews did not write on stone like the Egyptians or on clay like the Mesopotamians, so we have very few remains of parchments or of papyrus. So the study of it, the ones that were not recuperated by Professor Koenig, and most of the documents were to be found in the Rockefeller Museum, which is in East Jerusalem. So in 1948, the Jordanians conquered it. Rockefeller built a museum. But in 1967, we reconquered East Jerusalem. However, there was a professor from Harvard appointed to oversee the entire project. And I believe his name was Professor Strunik. And for decades, no information was coming out. Nothing was being published. He claimed it was difficult to decipher, one had to be careful, new processes being developed to work on these parchments. It turned out he was a drunkard and an anti-Semite. And finally, in the 90s, 2000s, his hold over the whole project was broken. And many people questioned why the Israeli government didn't simply take it away from him throughout the decades after 1967, but they didn't. And then finally it was uncovered. I had the privilege to study with Professor Lawrence Schiffman at NYU, who's specialized in this area and is also a Torah scholar. And his understanding is that these were a group of Kohanim, originally from Jerusalem, who were disenchanted with the religious leadership, who spurned the centers of power and set off for a more spiritual life in the desert. Yet they were still very much focused on the temple. There's a temple scroll, and they were focused on going to mikvah a lot. Why were there no women? So it looked like that this was a retreat for men that they founded, where men would come and study and have a spiritual retreat for a year. And some of them passed away when they were off at this retreat. So who were they? They were a group of very religious Jews who were focused on studying spirituality, living in the desert as recluses. It's as simple as that. So let's move on. The next group we're going to look at is a breakaway from the Jewish community, who, as we mentioned, were known as the Notzrim. Now, the figure of Jesus is obviously very loaded, and what we're going to try and do is try and look at the historic Jesus. Who was Jesus? Now, if you look at the picture on the left, this is the recreation of a Judean man from the Galilee from the 1st century BCE. Doesn't quite look like many of the pictures of Jesus you see. Fine-figured, very white Caucasian male. And that tells a ton, because the Jewish origins of Jesus were not looked at for many centuries. Now the Christian community is embracing it more. But what I like to show is that Jesus was an observant Jew, and what we today call an Orthodox Jew, who lived a full Jewish life, and in fact advocated that. Look at the first quote from Mark: "Think not that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill them." He was a teacher, teaching, itinerant teacher, moving about from town to town. And his message was one which wasn't new then and has been seen more recently, that the religious establishment is too focused on the details, on the legalities, is not focused enough on the heart, on the love, on feeling, on how you treat other people, and is maybe corrupt or too focused on money as well, which is testified to his reaction to that with overturning the money changers' tables in the temple. Now, the money changers were exchanging foreign currency for Judean currency because people came for the festivals on pilgrimage. But those were his criticisms. Maybe some of them did have some validity, but we're going to see that it seems like he started out advocating the upholding of the law, but then he started to veer from that. So the next point is his teaching, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath, implying the Sabbath shouldn't be burdensome on someone. It should be something that works for man. We find the same teaching in the Talmud. The Sabbath was handed over to you, and you were not handed over to the Sabbath. Babylonian Talmud, Yoma 85b, of course. And what we're showing is that his teachings were, many of them were mainstream Jewish teachings. All things that men should do to you, you should do to them, which is a positive formulation of Hillel's, which is what is hateful to others, do not do to them, and the rest is commentary, also from the Babylonian Talmud. Another interesting Jewish teaching, which he taught, but this time with a change in theology or change in application. If anyone slaps you on the cheek, turn them to the other cheek. This is from Sermon on the Mount, 539. And it parallels the teaching in the book of Lamentations, written by the prophet Jeremiah, who says, if someone strikes you, give him the other cheek. Now, Lamentations was talking about when God destroyed Jerusalem. If God gives you a hard lick, accept it and have faith. Jesus applied it to his relations to other people. But really, now, what is the Jewish view on Jesus? So first of all, he presented himself as a messianic figure, and certainly his followers saw him as that. Now, the challenge of the historical Jesus is that the apostles were written beginning 30 years after his life, up to 60 to 70 years after his life. So we're already not getting the first-hand accounts. Furthermore, so what we see is that he positioned himself as a messianic figure. Now, this wasn't the only messianic movement or person trying to jumpstart a messianic movement at the time. And his name, Yeshu, is really Yehoshua, which means Joshua. And there are many Jews named Joshua. There were many other Yeshus as well. In fact, there's a discussion about the Yeshu in the Talmud, which seems to address Jesus, not favorably, and I'll tell you why. But that Jesus seemed to have lived much earlier than this Jesus. So there are some rabbis in the Middle Ages said it's not the same one. It's not clear, but it is not out of the pale of Judaism for someone to be seen as a messianic figure if he fulfills the Messiah's role of bringing world peace and bringing Jews back to Judaism and to Israel. Then Maimonides said he is the Messiah. If he dies and doesn't fulfill that, then according to Judaism, he's not the Messiah. But he was killed, and his students still advocated for him being the Messiah. Now, about the death of Jesus, it is possible that the rabbis handed him over to the Romans. Now, let's look at this. For the Romans, if you're running an empire and someone is going around saying he's the king of the Jews, meaning the ruler of the Jews, that is rebellion. And that ultimately is why the Romans would have crucified him as a political dissident. From the rabbi's point of view, there are things in which he veered off from the rabbis. He rejected rabbinic teaching on certain laws. And if a person rejects some of the laws, they're an errant Jew, maybe even a heretic Jew. But if someone is a teacher and is leading other people away from the teachings of the rabbi, that is also insurrection. That's taking down the teachings of Judaism, and that is liable capital punishment. So Jews did not impose capital punishment at the time, and even when they could, it was done very, very sparingly. But it is possible that they handed him over to the Romans, but very clearly, the Romans are the ones who killed Jesus. Now, why is that so important? Because of the charge of deicide, which we'll talk about in our next installment of the crash course, but the real area where Judaism would veer away from, where Christianity veered away from Judaism, was in the divine nature of Jesus. Now, did he present himself as the Son of God? Did he not? Just be aware that King David in the Psalms says to the Jewish people, you, B'nai Elohim atem, you are sons of God. Of course, not meaning it literally. So could Jesus have said that and not meant it literally? It's possible. But clearly his disciples presented him, positioned him as Son of God. And at that point, it's completely out of the pale of Judaism to say a human being can become God. That's likened to idolatry. And the followers were rejected. Now, what happened was that the rabbis sent Shaul, an envoy to Damascus, to try and bring Jews back into Judaism from this new messianic movement. And some of them were slipping back, and that's why eventually they changed the Sabbath to Sunday instead of Saturday, so the Jews wouldn't slip back. But Paul apparently had this epiphany. He turned 180 degrees, became a proponent, a follower of Jesus. Of course, Jesus had died, but he saw had an image of him, a revelation of Jesus. And he came up with a great strategy, which was that there were many non-Jews who were very drawn to Judaism and monotheism at the time. But because an ideology that said all people are equal before the law, everyone is created in the image of God, protect the weak and the poor, these all had great appeal. However, when you then ask the men, okay, well, circumcise yourselves, keep kosher, keep Shabbat, not so easy. So in a sense, Paul created a marketable Judaism, a Judaism light, which could be marketed to non-Jews. He got rid of the commandments except for the 10 Commandments, and it spread like wildfire. And so began not just a shoot-off group or sect, but a shoot-off movement from Judaism. And we will talk more next week about the rise of Christianity. But the Christians were persecuted very much persecuted by the Romans at the time. We're going to move on in our next installment to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the other sects. So stay tuned for part C of the third of the crash course in Jewish history.